Last week we ended chapter 11 of Matthew, and it ended with this passage that, I often refer to these as like refrigerator passages. I don't know, this one reminded me a little bit more of a needlepoint passage more. I could see it done that way with nice little flowers in the background and put on the wall. And it's a great passage. It's just the nature of it made me think that. Matthew 11, 28 through 30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Again, a passage we're probably familiar with. I looked at that and I thought, this tells us three things that maybe you don't stop and think about all the time. But first of all, it tells us that everyone is wearing a yoke or bearing a burden. Now, in Jesus' day, he was using these metaphors. Of course, a yoke was this wooden harness that an ox or set of oxen would wear to pull a load, to pull the burden. So that's what he's talking about. Well, for us, obviously, it's not that physical thing. It's definitely a spiritual realm, but also, as it impacts our mental, our emotional state, just, the way that we approach life and what it is, how we view things and operate. He says, every one of us, this is telling us, has a way that we approach life, has a yoke, a burden that, we're wearing and we're bearing. Everyone, or else there would be no sense in him saying, okay, you obviously are wearing a hard yoke and a heavy burden. Come to me, mine is light and easy. And they say, well, why don't we just get rid of it altogether and have nothing? So everyone is wearing a yoke and bearing a burden. The second truth of this is that Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light. He says that, and which implies others are not. Anything else is going to be heavier and harder than Jesus. And then the third truth from these few verses is that we can choose. Jesus starts it off. He says, "Come to me." Here's the invitation. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll make things different. I'll give you rest." And then he says, "Take my yoke upon you." So we can choose which yoke we have. And so you put those together. Everyone is wearing a yoke, bearing a burden. Jesus is light and others are hard and heavy. And we can choose. Why would anyone not choose Jesus? Why would anyone not choose the easy yoke, the light burden? But I thought about it, and even last week, you remember we ended with these verses, and I asked, do you feel like this describes you? And I saw some heads that like, no, not really. And I've been looking at myself the past few weeks, and as this focus on worship has become apparent, I'm like, okay, God, it feels like I'm missing something. Is worship the key, or what's the key? What is it? Because I'm going through life, and I don't feel restful at times, God. I don't feel like things are and this definitely doesn't mean that you won't have problems in life. Doesn't mean there won't be trials in life. It's how you respond to them. There's still going to be things, but how do you feel about them? How do you bear them? What it is that's happening? And so it made me realize, and the main idea today, if our yoke isn't easy and our burden isn't light, well, it must not be Jesus that we're wearing and bearing, right? It just says it right here. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Well, if we don't feel that, no matter what we've thought, no matter what we've wanted, it's not Jesus' yoke that we're wearing. Well, chapter 12, and that's where we're going to be today. So if you have your Bibles, tablets, phones, if you have one of the church Bibles, it's on page 1518. Other Bibles more toward the end, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Chapter 12, the first verses give examples of this. So it really follows right after these verses in 11. You remember the chapter numbers, even the verse numbers were added later. So Jesus talks about this burden, this yoke, and then he gives some examples. Here's what it is, the heavy side, and here's what I can do differently. And today we have a main idea and a central question. We're going to make sure we get this idea across. The question I want us to think about today, which yoke and which burden have I chosen? Is it Jesus, or is it something else? So let's look, chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Now, at that time, as Matthew uses that, it doesn't always mean chronologically. You line it up with some of the other Gospels, and they're not always in the same order, but he's definitely saying thematically. He's saying, I want you to realize that what's happening here, as I tell you this story, it is tied into what just happened. And so again, Jesus just talked about this yoke and this burden. He says, all right, this is related to it. Read this in light of. They went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. Now, again, part of the chronology and part of the things Matthew leaves out, his disciples, we just saw the last chapter, he sent them out on a mission, and we don't see them coming back. But here they are, and they're with him. They're going through this grain field, and they're hungry. So they're picking some of it off and then rubbing it in their fingers to get the husk off and eating the grain. Well, when the Pharisees, these Jewish religious leaders, saw this, they said to Jesus, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was and still is Saturday. Sometimes we think, and people will call it, the Christian, or Sunday is the new, it's the Christian Sabbath. No. Saturday always was, always will be the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. There's some parallels that come over to Sunday, but when he talks about Sabbath, that's what he's talking about. And God had made it very clear to the Jews in the law with Moses and the Israelites after Egypt, you are to rest on the Sabbath. Matter of fact, when God first instituted that principle, when someone violated it, he was put to death. God was very serious about resting on the Sabbath, and it was for our good, for the people's good. But the thing he wasn't was very specific on what it means to rest on the Sabbath. He didn't give a lot of details. Well, the Jews weren't too happy about that. Down through the years, they developed details, specifics. Here's what it means to rest on the Sabbath. And they had 39 categories of work. And then they had subcategories under each of those. This is what you have to do, and this is what you can't do on the Sabbath. And so resting on the Sabbath was really more work than ever for them. And so when they say your disciples are doing what's unlawful because they're just walking through this grain field, picking grain and rubbing it in their fingers, that to the Pharisees was harvesting. Rubbing that in their fingers, picking it and rubbing it, that was harvesting. You couldn't do that on the Sabbath. You're breaking the Sabbath. Again, the Old Testament didn't say that. It said don't work. They had come along and added all these specifics. So the disciples weren't breaking God's law, but they were breaking what the Pharisees considered their version of the law. Well, Jesus answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? And again, I love Jesus' little digs here and there. He's talking to the religious leaders, and he says, haven't you read? That's all they did all day, was read the Bible over and over. They'd read it 100 times. He's like, haven't you guys read what David, so this would be King David before he's King David, did when he and his companions were hungry? This is one of the times that David was on the run from King Saul. And you remember David and Saul had sort of a love-hate relationship, or really sort of a love-hate-hate, because it was about 2/3 hate. And this was one of the times. Saul was trying to kill him. David and his men were on the run. They were hungry, and so he entered the house of God. This was before the temple, the tabernacle. And he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Again, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, God set up the tabernacle, and one of the things was this bread called the showbread, the bread of the presence of God, and it was only for the priests to eat. Well, none of the Jews had any problem with David eating this. They realized that it sort of superseded. David was going to be this chief figure in the Jewish history. He was going to be the chief king. He needed to do this. It was important. And so these Jewish leaders didn't think a thing about that. Well, then verse 5, or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? Now, desecrate, it doesn't mean they purposely mock it or anything. What it's saying is priests have to work on the Sabbath. Part of the Sabbath is all these things that the actions in and of themselves would be considered work. Well, that's what the priests did. And no one looked at them and said, oh, you're breaking the Sabbath. No, they were keeping the Sabbath by keeping the other commands about sacrifices and things. Well, Jesus then says in verse 6, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, he mentions three chief fixtures of the Jewish law: the temple, the sacrifices, and the Sabbath. Now, who initiated all three of those? Whose idea were those three? God's, exactly. This wasn't something they made up. God had said, I want there to be a temple. He said, he gave instructions for the tabernacle. It moved over into the temple. God said, here's the sacrifices I command you to give. And God had even said, here's the Sabbath, and I command you to observe it, to honor it, not to work on it. God had instituted all these things for the purpose of worshiping him. Well, the problem is these objects for worship had become objects of worship. They were now worshiping the temple more than they were worshiping the God whose house it was. They were worshiping the sacrifices and the rituals more than the God it pointed to, and the Sabbath more than the God who said, I want you to have rest. And so in a sense, their focus wasn't on God. It was really on themselves and everything they had done. You know, wow, isn't this awesome, this temple, these it was all about them. It become all about them instead of all about God. Well, verse 9, going on from that place, so again, you see this continues. Read this in light of what we've just seen. He went into their synagogue, basically the local church. In the towns that were separate, that were far away from Jerusalem, they would have these synagogues because the people couldn't get to the temple every week. And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, these same Pharisees, asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So once again, God had said nothing about it, but they had their set of laws, and they certainly knew what the answer was, and they're looking for some reason that we can accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? In other words, Sabbath day comes and you've got your sheep, and it wouldn't be a pet sheep. It'd be part of your stock that you would be living off of in different ways. He falls into a pit. There was no one among them that would say, oh, we got to wait. We can't get him out on the Sabbath. That would be work. We got to wait till the next day. No, they would definitely get that sheep out. Well, Jesus is making the point, and he says it there, how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? If you wouldn't leave that sheep there for several hours, why should I leave this man in this condition that he's been in any longer than necessary? And Jesus says, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. I was reading one commentary, and he sort of saw a little dig there. I'm trying to do good on the Sabbath. What are you doing? You're looking for ways to accuse me. Talk about violating the Sabbath. The true spirit of it. That's what they were doing. And so then 13, Jesus said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Now, I thought about it. Of all the miracles Jesus performs, this one he probably does about the least amount of work. He doesn't even touch the person. He definitely doesn't make some mud as he does at times. He just says, stretch out your hand. He just speaks to him. And the man, all he does is stretch out his hand. The same thing he would do, that was not illegal on the Sabbath. You could do this. Well, the man did it, and he was healed. And then you have what I would say is like a wait a minute moment in this passage. All right, so the Pharisees are a little upset, but really you're going to kill Jesus over this? And just the nature, too, it says they had to now look for, plotted how they might kill him because they knew his argument made sense. They couldn't take this, to some higher court and say, I did this on the Sabbath, because he made a good point about, you wouldn't leave your sheep there. I'm not going to leave this guy here. But it still just infuriated them so much. Why were they so angry? And I think it goes back to, again, these things that had been given by God to focus on God, they had started focusing on themselves. Instead of a focus on God, it became a focus on man. And specifically for these Jewish leaders, it became a focus on them versus the people in general. It reminded me, Darren for school had to read the book Animal Farm. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a critique of communism. And it starts off as Orwell was critiquing how communism often did. It starts off with this revolution where everyone's equal. And their slogan was, all animals are equal. Well, then the leaders start to enjoy their position of leadership and start to, take privileges for themselves. And by the end of the story, the phrase has been modified to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. That's what happened to these Jewish leaders. These Pharisees actually started with a good intention. Again, these synagogues and things, as the people got decentralized, as they were farther from the temple, the Pharisees were instituted to try to help them obey God and keep the law. But it became about this focus then on themselves. And so you look at these two incidents in light of chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. And you see how burdened these people were. And you see how weary their spiritual lives must have been. And going back a couple chapters, you remember in chapter 9, verse 36, Jesus said he had compassion on the crowds because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. That's the people of his day. He looked out at them, and he wasn't talking about physically. He was spiritually harassed, spiritually bullied, and helpless. They couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't overthrow these. They couldn't say, no, you're wrong. They were like sheep without a shepherd. The people, the leaders who should have been their shepherds, who should have been caring for them, they didn't. And that's the life these people had. That's the burden these people were bearing. But then the question always is, all right, well, what's the lesson for us? What can we learn from this? And I think there's a few things. The first idea I see from this passage is that we are wearing a yoke and bearing a burden. I think we know that, but I also say that in light of the fact one of the key deceptions out there in the world, and of course Satan is the master of deception, is that Christians are bearing a burden. Okay, yeah, that's obvious, but non-Christians, no, they're free. They can do whatever they want, carefree. No rules, nothing like that. Well, again, what's it mean, this yoke and burden? What exactly is this metaphor? And, Jesus is talking here, it's the set of assumptions that you live by. It's the principles, the beliefs, the priorities. It's how you face life, how you live life and approach life. And again, for the Jews, they lived life under this system of legalism, which said, I've got to do this and be good enough and follow all these rules, not that God gave, but that the leaders gave. And that's what life is like. And it was terrible. It was a burden. Really, this yoke and the burden, a word that we would use today would be worldview. It's how you view the world, how you think the world operates, what you think is true about life, and when things happen, how you face that, your worldview. And if you've ever heard about this, there's all kinds of different worldviews and different distinctions, but you could divide every worldview into two categories. You either believe in a God or you don't. Yeah, they're all going to fall into one of those. You either believe in a God or you don't. Well, you think about that. Again, the not believing in God, if God's not there, where's the focus going to be? It's going to be on me. I'm the most important. I'm the greatest. Now, I may decide to do good things for other people, but it's because I've decided. I am the most important person under that worldview when there's no God. Well, that's what sin is. We talk about sins, lying and stealing and cheating, but sin in general, sin with a capital I in the middle, it's this focus on me instead of God. And that's still a yoke. That's still a burden. Romans 6:16 is on your handout. It says, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you're slaves of the one you obey? Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness." See what he's saying? You're a slave to one or the other. You're either a slave to sin, or you're a slave to obedience. Obedience to who? To God. So you're a slave to sin or you're a slave to God. Don't think that, you're either a slave to God or you're free. He says, no, those aren't the two options. You're a slave to God or you're a slave to sin. And you see later, he doesn't like using that metaphor. It makes him uncomfortable because he talks about the freedom in Christ. But he's making the point, there is no absolute freedom. And so that's a key deception to think, if you're not a Christian, you don't have all those rules. You're free. Another key deception is it's possible to believe in God. So again, the two major worldviews, God, no God. It's possible to believe in God and still focus on me. Again, if you're not believing in God, obviously your focus is you. It's the only thing left. But it's possible to believe in God and still focus on me. And worse, to think I am focused on God because I do some godly things. Now, you've heard me talk about the two columns, and I put them down here. Again, I think under this worldview of God, there's two ways of looking at things. These would be the two columns under that. You can look at God through the mindset, through the lens, the perspective of grace. And if you look at God through grace, well, then the focus is on God. Whereas legalism, it's on me. If you look at God through grace, then your focus is on spiritual realities. There's a physical world, and it's important, but you realize the spiritual is even more important. What's unseen, what's behind everything. If you look at the world through grace, then you look at the world in light of faith instead of works. How do I relate to this God? Well, legalism says if I'm good enough, I please him. If I'm good enough, I get into heaven. If I'm good enough, he's happy with me today. It's how good I do, the good things, not the bad things. And grace says, no, it's by our faith. By grace through faith, you're saved. And then faith actually comes in twice in the grace mindset because there's also, the Bible talks about, under grace, we live by faith and not by sight. Sight looks at all these physical things and all the things of the world and me and says, that's what's the most important, the things I can see, touch, feel. And faith says, no, there's a God behind everything, and I trust him more than anything. I rely on him more than anything. So we are all wearing a yoke. We are all bearing a burden. Again, if you believe in God or you don't, that's one big demarcation. But then there's also, okay, I believe in God, but where are we on the scale of grace and legalism? Because I can believe in God and still focus a lot on me. And if I do, we're going to see I don't have a lot of rest. And that leads into this next thing. The second key idea, the world's yoke is hard and the world's burden is heavy. Now, when I use the word world, I'm talking about all alternatives. Again, it might be a non-Christian, a non-God alternative, sin, legalism, whatever it is. If I'm not bearing Jesus' yoke, any other yoke is hard and the burden is heavy. Not only does the non-Christian view have a yoke, which a lot of people say, again, we're the ones who are free. It's you Christians who have all those rules. Not only do they have a yoke and bear a burden, theirs is actually harder and heavier than Christians. And you might say, why? Well, Christianity has all those rules, and not being a Christian, it doesn't have those. I mean, you got to obey the laws or get thrown in jail, but there's a lot of things that we're free to do that you Christians aren't. Well, stop and think. Again, if you don't believe in God, where's your focus? It's on me. And at first you might think, well, that's pretty good, isn't it? That's all I got to worry about. You Christians got this little bracelet. What would Jesus do? I don't have that. I'm like, what do I want to do? It's all about what I desire, what I want, what's going to make me happy. Sounds pretty good. My world revolves around me, and that's true. But you know what? It also depends entirely on me. As I'm facing life, if I don't believe there's a God, that means whatever I face, the only way I'm getting through it is the resources I have, or that I can come into contact with, that I can garner from friends, or so, whatever it is. But it's definitely limited to this physical realm. What I can see, what I can touch, what's real out there, that's what I face life with. And you know what? You face some things in life at times that really push the physical world and my abilities to the limit. It's like, I don't have enough. I can call on all my friends, whether it's material, financial support, whether it's emotional support. Everything I got, I still am lacking. It's just not working. And you hear people sometimes that maybe they're not lacking in the finances and all those things. You hear, where there's movie stars or things, and they get to a point and says, all this stuff I have, all this stuff I've done, I have no sense of fulfillment. I have no satisfaction. The world hasn't been able to provide that. And that's the problem with the non-God view, but it's the same with legalism. Again, you look at these Jews of Jesus' day, they totally believed in God. No one believed in God as much or more than these Jews, but their lives were miserable. Now, I put the verse there, Matthew 23, and the they is the Pharisees. The Pharisees tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on people's shoulders. That's the life these Jews lived under. Heavy burdens that the leaders had said, here's the way you have to live. Here's what you have to do. And it was all focused on the physical and their efforts and their works. Wasn't it all focused on God? And that's the life that they were living. They really had the worst of both worlds. We don't get to be free from God's rules, but boy, keeping them is sure a burden, the way these Pharisees have piled everything on there. Well, that's the same is true for people today if we're not focused on God. We're still living under this heavy, hard yoke and heavy burden. And not Jesus. And that's the third idea. Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light. And again, the first reaction of some people, and maybe even us, there's a part of your brain that says, how is that true? Christians, they're commanded to do all these things. They got to attend church. There's non-Christians. They're already getting ready for the game. They're not here at some church service, sleeping a little bit later than we are. And Christians, we're told we're supposed to give and we're supposed to serve and just sacrifice in general. That's what that Christian lifestyle. How can Christianity be easier? Well, a worldview that believed in God, a worldview that does believe in God, as Christianity does, it focuses and relies on God. So as we face life, it's not all about what I can do. I face a tough situation and I look, here's the resources I have financially and skill-wise and whatever it is. Here's what I've got, but you know what? There's God. He's in play in this situation too. It's not just the physical world that I have as a resource, things I can see and touch. There's a God behind it and underneath it. He's real too to me. And so as I face things, I don't have to depend just on me. A worldview that believes in God focuses and relies on God. Or at least I need to say it, it should. It should, right? But it doesn't always. Again, we can get tied up that I totally believe in God, but we can slant toward that legalistic frame of mind that says, you know what, the focus is on me. I look at this situation and I'd feel a little more comfortable if the things I could control. I'm going to do all I can do, and not in the sense of just sit back and do nothing, but, it's really on me. God, if you can maybe chip in a little later, okay, but this is going to stand or fall based on what I'm able to do or not. God, I'm going to relate to you. I'm going to live this life based on my good works and what I can see instead of faith. Jesus said in verse 28 again, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Rest from what? If you're resting, that means you were doing something before, right? You're doing something, that whole marathon we're talking about, we'd need a lot of rest after that. You come home from a day's work, you sat down, you're resting from what? The day's work. Even in music, a rest. You were playing some note of music, well, now you're resting, you're not doing that. What's Jesus giving rest from? I think it's this idea of all depending on me. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened with this yoke that the Pharisees had put on you of legalism, that it all depends on you. That your relationship with God depends on your good works to Him. That getting through life depends upon your physical effort. That is wearing you down. Come to me and I'll give you rest from that. I will give you rest. And imagine that rest. Imagine being able to face those same things. And again, it's not that you won't have difficulties in life, but imagine being able to face them with rest. And face them with peace and joy. Because I depend on God, not just me. There's a verse on your handout from Matthew 6. I'm going to move that down below, so just hold that in readiness. But imagine being able to do that. Again, instead of this burden, this weariness that has been placed on me, or even as, again, Christians now, hundreds of years later, we've adopted this legalistic focus on me that's so tough, I can have true rest and peace and joy. And that's the last thing. We can choose our yoke and burden. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. If we're not experiencing rest, if you wouldn't say, my yoke is easy, the one I'm bearing, and my burden is light, we need to ask why. And I've talked to some people, and I think maybe the mindset that runs through some people is, well, this is as good as it gets. This is the Christian life. At least I'm going to heaven, and it's as good as it gets now. Or at least it's as good as it gets for me. I see some Christians, and wow, it seems like they're always peaceful. And they got I don't have it. Don't know how to get it. I'm just going to suffer through until I get to heaven. No, it made it very clear in this passage that we can choose. Matter of fact, it's made it clear that if we've been a Christian for any length of time, we have chosen already. We have chosen. And the presence or absence of rest indicates what we've chosen, not what we say. If I were to ask you, have you taken on Jesus' yoke and bearing His burden? We could all raise our hands and say yes. But if we're not experiencing this rest, if we wouldn't say that the yoke is easy, the burden is light, we haven't. We haven't really. We've wanted to, we've intended to, we've tried to, we haven't. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." If that doesn't describe our life, we are not wearing Jesus' yoke. It's just true. Okay, is there a root problem today? What is it that's keeping us from doing it? Because I think we'd all like, Rachel, would you like to have life easier? Yes. Again, not situations aren't going to be there, but I can face them in a way that I'm not as stressed. I've got some joy, some peace. Absolutely. Well, what's preventing us? Again, the heart of grace is faith. And legalism's yoke and burden is works and sight, the opposite of faith. That's really the key issue. And so the root problem, I think, is taking that knowledge that we know. Living for God is living by faith, trusting Him. I think the root problem is actually doing it. It's one thing to know it, but to put it into practice day by day, instead of going back to that thing that we're used to of works, God, I know you'll have to be happier with me if I just do a little better. Or sight. I face this thing in life, and God, yeah, I know you're there, but this extra job, that's what's going to make the difference. More money, peace, seeing that things are changed, absolutely. That's what's going to, now I can rest. Living by that faith is so hard because faith isn't tangible. And we can't see it first. In a sense, it's not logical to us that really I'm going to have more rest, more peace, trusting something I can't see instead of the things I can. Now, it just doesn't make, God, I got to admit, it doesn't make sense. And God says, you know what? You're right. When you look at things through human eyes, it doesn't. I put the verse 1 Corinthians 1:25. It says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. Now, is God ever foolish? No, but the world looks at God's way of doing things and says, that's foolish. And God says, yeah, I can understand you think that. Guess what? My foolishness is wiser than your wisdom. It's wiser than the way you've been doing things and think you should be doing things. Is really what's best. And so that's the root problem. It's looking at really living by faith and saying, nah, can't do it. I want to, I'd like to, just doesn't seem to make sense, God. And so the key to overcoming that, it's that same thing. If the heart of grace is faith, if the root problem is living that faith, the key to overcoming is faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, for we live by faith, not by sight. And what I love about that verse, when you read it in context, it's not like Paul then goes on for a whole chapter to explain what it means and make his point and prove it. You Christians, you better get this. Understand, let me convince you, you need to live by faith, not by sight. It's a total aside. He's saying one thing and just in the middle, because Christians, we live by faith, not by sight. And he just goes on. It'd be like me saying, as humans, we breathe air, not water. I don't have to stand up here and prove it to you. Let me give you 5 reasons why that's true. We all know it's true. That's what Paul was doing with this. Christians, we live by faith, not by sight. Let's move on. It's just an assumption. It's an understood. Well, what is that faith? And what's it mean to live by faith? Faith starts with belief. And sometimes you distinguish those two because belief is something in your mind. I believe a certain fact to be true. Well, as Christians, we believe there's a God. That's the fundamental tenet of Christianity, of our life. We believe there's a God. Well, stop and think what that means, that I believe there's a God. I believe there is an uncreated creator of the universe. I believe that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. I believe this all-powerful God sustains the universe. He didn't just set it in motion and now, God, we're fine on our own. We'll check back with you later. If it weren't for him, the world wouldn't hold together. And I believe that this all-powerful, uncreated creator created us for a relationship. And when we screwed it up, he said, I'm going to fix it. And he sent his son to save us, to redeem us. Talk about God. We believe he's the creator, the sustainer, the redeemer. That's what we believe. Well, again, to use an illustration, if you believe that you breathe air, then you're going to do things that correspond to that, aren't you? You're not going to jump in the pool out there and inhale. No, because I believe I breathe air, so I live consistently with that. Well, the same thing. If I believe there is a God, if I believe he's the creator of the universe, the sustainer of the universe, the redeemer, he's offered a chance at eternal life to people like me who've screwed up, there should be some things that characterize my life. I should then live by that faith. That belief should show itself, and that's what it means to live by faith. Well, what's it mean? If I believe there is an uncreated God, he sustains the world, he redeems it, what should happen? What should our life look like? Well, one, I should rely on him, ultimately, not me. How much sense does it make to look at me and my limited power and whatever it is, and even if me was Bill Gates and all his money, or the president and all his power, again, to look at me compared to God and say, yeah, I've got this. How much sense does that make? It'd be like jumping in the pool and inhaling. If I believe there's an all-powerful, uncreated creator who sent his son to redeem me, then I need to surrender to him. I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for him. Ultimately, I need to say, God, your will be done. Whatever it is, God, up front, blank page, I'll sign it. And then follow through on that commitment. Those are some of the things that it means to live and walk by faith. Again, faith in God, it manifests itself in that commitment. It reminded me of Luke 9:23, this verse we talk about often. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. That sounds crazy on the surface, but again, if God is who we believe he is, there's nothing else I can do. Anything else wouldn't make sense. Faith in God versus faith in me allows me to rest because I can rely on him. But it also leads me to surrender and commit because he's God and I'm not. And then also, I would say the relationship between faith and commitment. And it was interesting at first. I had like two ideas. I'm going through this, like, what's the key? Well, it's faith. Oh, no, it's commitment. Well, how do they go together? Again, faith in God, this belief in Him, leads to a life of faith that includes commitment. Do you know what? The faith also means that I have faith that kind of surrender to God, that kind of commitment to Him, which seems totally scary. God, just give you a blank check? No way. I have faith that that's really a lighter yoke, an easier yoke, a lighter burden than not doing it. And really, what am I saying? I have faith that that's a better life now. Is to totally surrender to God and totally commit is better than holding out to some little area and saying, God, I'm going to give you all this, but I'm going to hold back here because I'm just not sure. And what are we not sure about? Let's be honest. I'm not sure my life would be better. I mean, if we absolutely knew, if there was some guarantee written in stone, no, your life will be better if you 100% surrender, we do it. So if we're not doing it, there's some part of us that's saying, God, I'm really not sure. I know you say it. And if you could show, God, if you could show me first. Well, that's sight. That's not faith. You don't see it until you do believe it, until you take that step, and then you see it is true. And even then, you know what? Satan's going to come at you from every angle and try and convince you, no, it's not. You were fooled for a while. Go back to trusting and believing in yourself, relying on yourself. Well, where has that gotten us? Again, all of us who said, I'm not really sure that I am experiencing the rest of Christ, the easy yoke, the light burden, I don't think that describes my life. Well, guess why? Because we are holding on to something. And whatever it is, you know, you hold on to in some little area and you end up holding on to these expectations of what life should be like and fears of what life would be like if I gave up. All that stuff, it all goes together. You know, I can't see ahead of time what life's going to be like if I totally commit and surrender, but I can see what's been happening by not doing that. It makes sense to give the other a shot. Step out in faith. Well, how do we have that kind of faith? The last verses today, I believe, are the basis. After these two incidents of the Sabbath and the Jewish leaders getting upset, verse 15, aware that the Jews were trying to kill him, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. Now, why did he do that? It comes up often. He's like, don't tell others about me. Did it ever really work? No, they told these people, and you had all these crowds coming for healing. Why doesn't he want them? Is it because he didn't want the crowds? I think the reason is because they wouldn't get the meaning of it right. You know, it's not just so much, don't tell people that I'm here and I can heal you. Don't go out and tell them what you think this means. That he, you know, even in the sense that he's a Messiah, because you're going to screw up the kind of Messiah it is. Like, I don't want you telling the story. Have you ever been in that situation where you're with someone else and it's like, you're not telling the story right? You know, I hate to pick on your parents, Lisa, but every time we were around them, you know, they'd start this story, and her dad would, you know, last Tuesday, no, it was Wednesday. You know, we went over for lunch. No, it was dinner. You know, and we had the special. No, we had the, you're not telling the story right. Well, that's what Jesus is saying to these people. I don't want you telling others about me. Not that I'm able to heal you, and so don't bring your family member to be healed. I'm fine with that. I don't want you telling what you think it means. Because you're going to get all focused on the physical, because that's where you've been so long. The leaders have put this mindset on you, this worldview that says it's all about that. Well, you're going to keep doing that, and you're going to screw up the story. And so he says, it even goes on, this was to fulfill. Why did he tell them not to say that? This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, God speaking about Jesus, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim what? Justice to the nations. That's going to be his focus. He will not quarrel or cry out, nor no one will hear his voice in the streets. And that's not that he wouldn't speak at all. It's the idea he's not going to just argue with the Pharisees on their same level. It's not just going to be about arguing with them. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. That's talking about the people. The people were a bruised reed. They were a smoldering wick. They were just hanging on by a thread. Jesus isn't going to come along then and say, oh, now my way, and force it on them, and it's going to snuff them out till he's brought justice through to victory. Now, it doesn't mean once he does, he's going to snuff them out. It means that he won't even need to at that point. They'll be healed. They'll be better. In his name, the nations will put their hope. And again, you can't see it entirely right here, but as you look at the broader picture, you see that is so different than what the Jews thought. In his name, the nations. In other translations, it says the Gentiles. The Jews as a whole didn't care about the Gentiles. Jesus is saying, my kingdom's for them too, and that my kingdom brings hope. Not the kind of hope you're thinking about of, hey, get us out from under the Romans. True biblical spiritual hope. That's the message. And that's why Jesus didn't want them telling, because they wouldn't have gotten this right. Jesus' miracles prove his identity, that he was the Messiah. Well, his ministry showed the focus, that it's a spiritual kingdom that I'm bringing. Well, I said this is the basis for having faith. How is this at all the basis? Okay, now I can have faith because I read this Isaiah verse. Well, the passage in here, the verse that to me stands out and was maybe the hardest to understand, is verse 20, the second part. Till he has brought justice through to victory. What's that mean? Jesus is going to bring justice through to victory. You know, we often talk about justice. As a person, as a human, do I really want justice? Justice is getting what I deserve. That's the last thing I want is justice. So what's it mean? He's brought justice through to victory. Well, Romans 3:26, again on your handout, says the cross, was to show God's righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. The cross was to satisfy God's justice, that sin has to be punished. But God could have done that just by punishing all of us. Okay, there, I punished sin. But in the cross, Jesus suffered the punishment. So God was just. Sin has been punished, but he's also the justifier. Anyone who accepts this, you can be justified. You can still spend eternity with God. So justice has been met, but we don't get what we deserve. And that's what it's talking about. Jesus is going to bring justice through to victory. He's going to meet God's requirements for justice, but it's going to be a victory for us. So what this is talking about is the cross. And the cross, how is that the basis for faith? Remember that was where I started a few minutes ago? How is all this the basis? That I can have this faith I need to have. I can step out, I can live life trusting in God and what I can't see versus me. The answer is the cross. You know, the cross shows us like nothing else that God is in control and he loves us. You know, the whole Bible, it's throughout the Bible. You see it over and over. But you look at the cross and stop and think about it. God made this promise. We don't even know how many thousands of years before. In Genesis chapter 3, he says, you know, right after sin, I'm going to take care of this. Satan's going to, you know, bruise the heel. Eve's descendant is going to crush his head. I'm going to take care of this. And throughout the years, hundreds and thousands of years, God's plan, you got the flood, it's about to derail it, and God comes in. You got the Tower of Babel that we saw. It was about to derail it, and God comes in. He's in control the whole time. And why did he do it the whole time? Because he loves us. There was no other reason. It's like what we said in communion. He wasn't obligated. It's because he loves us. If we ever wonder about control and love, just look at the cross. Well, what do I need to do? Again, how do we take this and put it into practice? And I have three questions. First of all, where am I holding back? Because I think that holding back is actually lighter. I think that my burden is lighter, that life is a little better for me if I just don't go all out in that area. Is it witnessing? You know, I know I should, but boy, it makes me so uncomfortable to do that. There is no one who understands that as well as I do. If you know me well, you know I'd rather just sit in a corner and not talk. But you know those times when I do, not during this time, I'll talk as long as you'll let me, but it's those other times. Yeah, conversations, those are the things, yeah. But you know, when I do those, I'm like, wow, God, this is great. And even, you're going to get rejected more times than you're going to get accepted. And it's in not just that guilt obligation, like, oh, I checked it off, I knew I was supposed to, and now I did it. No, I feel good that I put that out there. You know, maybe it's about time with God. Again, like, God, my life's going to be a lot better if I don't spend that time with you, that 10, 20, 30 minutes in the day. You know what? It's going to be better if we do. Again, not a sense of guilt and obligation. It just is spending that time with God. You know, giving up control, which is just, again, such an oxymoron. Me giving up control to God. He's in control, acknowledging his control. It just seems so counterintuitive. God, that won't make my life better. Yeah, it will. It really will. You know, any area of obedience in the Bible, where God says do this or don't do this, and there's a part of me that, God, I'd rather do the opposite. I think my life would be better. No, it's not. And I moved this area of giving down here. I share that, and it's not because, the offerings are down, so talk about giving. It is the idea that there is nothing more tangible than money. It's black and white, dollars and cents, numbers. Here's what I have, here's what I need. And you trust God and you see somehow He provides. And it is the most tangible lesson. Lisa and I would not be where we're at in faith for so many other areas if it wasn't for things we'd seen in the financial area. And it says in Matthew, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And usually the thought is there, and it's certainly true. Wherever I put my treasure, that's what I'm committed to, I'm focused on, and that's true. But you know what? It also describes the kind of heart. Where my treasure is, I'm going to have a heart that matches that. And if my treasure's here on earth, I'm going to have a heart that's constantly worrying, that's constantly, do I have enough? Will I get by? Whereas if I put my treasure in heaven and trust God, I'm going to have a heart that's at peace. Because it's not how much is in the bank account. It's not how much is coming in. I told you last week, it's just blown my mind. I got this job, I thought, we're going to have so much extra money. Didn't happen. I left the job, we're going to be in so much trouble. Didn't happen. There's just God's math is so different. And once you get God's math, you can, God, okay, I'm in this situation with a family member, with a career, with a job. You came through in the finances when it was black and white. I'm going to trust you in this area that's a little bit less tangible. That's why I say it. Where am I holding back? Second question, what would faith and full commitment look like? In that area, I'm holding back. Okay, what would it look like if I wasn't? And to discover that, it's going to be those three areas of growth. All right, what's the Bible say about this? I'll talk with other Christians. What input do I get from them? And then you know what? I'll live life and see. And especially when it comes to this area of giving, God, I'll do it and see what happens. See what happens. And that situation, God will use it to show us and teach us. And then the third thing, when will I commit to walk by faith in this area? Hopefully you're going to say now. Maybe it's something talking to a person is going to be, you're not going to see them until Tuesday. God, whatever it is, here is when I'm going to make this commitment. Here's when I'm going to do this thing I've been holding back. And then I like to end with what will it look like, and I go back to those same verses. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Wouldn't you like to have that characterize your life? And again, do not take this meaning that you surrender to God and there'll be no more problems. You surrender to God and you'll face those problems in a way that is so different than before. You fully commit, you don't hold back, and it's just the rest that you experience. And I've seen this myself even recently. We just let go of some things and it just felt so much better. And then some different things did happen. And this morning, you'll look on your sheet, there's no starting the discussion question. I didn't know really what to ask, and I wanted to leave it up to you. What do you think about this? This has been one of the key passages for me. Because I've seen it in myself. I've been preaching this stuff and this key of worship, and it changes your life, and I thought, God, my life's not really changed yet. And worship is certainly key because, when we think about God as creator and sustainer and redeemer, what is that? That's worship. That's God, here's who you really are, and I want to focus on that. That's worship. So it is the key, but it's the key that leads to truly walking by faith and fully committing. This has been important to me. It's been an eye-opener, and I want to know what you think, what questions were raised, what things you've seen lately.